primary but invisible. What I mean is it's a political conversation. The United States is obsessed with the questions of what Congress is doing, what the current advocacy community is about. And I think that we wrestle a lot with the ways in which the United States suffers the politicalization of the issue to the degree that we forget all of the players and all of the tremendous resources that come together to make up, I think, a really remarkable story of care, compassion, and engagement. So we want to take a look at that story today, a little bit of the remarkable work that's being done by agencies represented by our panel. It's been my pleasure to do refugee work before I came to Boston College, and now running the Immigrant Integration Lab and teaching refugee and immigrant studies. I'm watching this field as a primary area for social work, but it's also a primary area for the faith community and educators, many others, because together, unless we all pay attention, the future is not going to be the past, and the continual growth and development and vitality of America will be seriously hurt. Let me use just one illustration. 50% of all Roman Catholics in the United States are Latinos. Now, if you were to take the attitude that the past was the predictor of the future, you'd have to worry a little bit because the Latinos are not necessarily sitting in Mass. There's much more desire to stay with Spanish-speaking congregations, to have a different kind of worship experience, and so many people find themselves outside of the tradition in which they grew up in another country. Somebody has to pay attention to this incredible changing dynamics and ask about our responsiveness to the changing demographics and find ways in which we can creatively welcome and include people to be a part of the new community that they've settled in. Today, we should stop and step back for a moment and appreciate that the faith community comes to the subject very legitimately. When you think about the three great faith communities, they each one have at the heart of their story migration. Yes, you think about the story of Israel, well, what is it? It's the story of the Passover. It's the story of people enslaved in Egypt who passed over and found the new land after 40 years of wandering as a pilgrim people, seeking refuge, seeking a promised land. A very powerful and central story for all of the West because of the contribution of Judaism to our basic mythology, our basic self-understanding, to our basic narrative of Western culture. But it's not just in Judaism. We forget that Muhammad was actually working in caravans as a young man. That was his first job. It's where he met his wife. And taking care of the caravans made him part of that very mobile people. And then as soon as they were a group of followers, they had to flee to Abyssinia, where they found refuge. They were no longer safe. And so another major moment in the history of Islam was to seek refuge. And then as part of spiritual discipline, one of the great tasks for most members of the Muslim community is at some point in their life to go on pilgrimage, to go to Mecca. So pilgrimage becomes a very major theme in Islam. And then, of course, for Christians, we understand that Jesus was born in a small town in a stable. His parents were away from home. But right after his birth, King Herod had a decree against the innocents, the children, and Jesus and his family had to flee as refugees, taking refuge in Egypt, waiting for the storm to pass, the political storm, and then he returned for his upbringing, his childhood, and the rest of it in Israel. Of course, Jesus was also the one to say to us, you welcomed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. These are the basic truths that are passed on through the generations. It's certainly true as well when we think about the texts that have been given to us. How about the basic text from Leviticus that tells us that we are to give welcome to those who are strangers among us because we were aliens ourselves in Egypt. So Leviticus lays out a mandate that is really very much a part of both Jewish and Christian faith in understanding that the welcome of the stranger is a primary task for the faith community. That said, it doesn't mean it happens. It certainly doesn't happen automatically or easily or universally. So we'll take a look in the panel at some of the ways in which it is happening, but I draw your attention to a couple of things that I think are worth thinking about. One is that around the world, the faith community often are the initiators, and when they aren't, there's a void. In Finland, only 2% of the people of Finland go to church. And when the government tries to find who can be mobilized, who cares about giving welcome and giving encouragement and integration to the newcomers who settled in Finland, they find themselves without the active ingredient that many of the other Western countries have had. It is a critical role and one that's not easily replaced by any other entity in the community. You go to France, I was fascinated to discover that it's the Jesuits who have counterbalanced the government. France is, liberty and solidarity, but in the face of a government that in its kind of broad welfare concept doesn't want to separate out any particular services for immigrants, often neglects the immigrant. And Jesuits have simply made a commitment that housing will be a primary task. They will make sure that all people are welcome, and that those who are left out in the cold, or those who have no room at the inn, will find themselves with a friend and an ally and an advocate through the Jesuit initiative to give a safe home. I think the same thing could be said of many other traditions who look, and these represent kind of, in my mind, three ways of understanding the faith community. We have those that are very hierarchical, and there's a mandate from on top that says this is something we do and something we should do. You'll see that a bit in the Catholic Church in the United States with a commitment to have refugee program, to support and care for the foreign-born populations. They used to have ethnic parishes, and now we have more multicultural parishes. You'll see it in a second model where I talk about an incentive-based model, and that's where the religious community can't mandate it to its congregations, but the congregations will often pick it up and do something significant because it's part of the teaching. Lutherans are a great example, where they have done curriculum and they have done national campaigns, and every congregation is asked to think about how they provide welcome and how they provide encouragement, what kind of outreach is part of their congregation's life to welcome people into their community as newcomers, but also to be welcomed to the congregation. And then the third one is very much the laissez-faire. What happens when there is no mandate, when there is no structure, when there's no incentive because there's no central governance in the faith community? We'll meet some leaders in the evangelical church and ask them how they address that. But so often the faith community that's mission-oriented will see the missionary opportunity in their own backyard. Yeah, sometimes it's about evangelism, but more often than not, it's about the human caring and building a bridge to give those who are outside, those who are in need, those who are left out, a place at the table. And I think we'll see some remarkable ways in which the individual congregations take this on as ministry or mission where they live. So we have a lot of ways in which the religious community organizes itself and participates. And I think one of the struggles that we have in the United States is we have so often held to the firm principle of the separation of church and state. Should these two bodies be mixed? I don't think so. Because by law, we don't want our government to do anything that institutionalizes religion. But on the other hand, under the administration of George Bush, a major change happened in the United States, where the faith community was affirmed as a primary provider of social services. And the government agreed that while somebody may have a lot of parameters around who they hire based on their religion or their faith, the willingness to sign a creed, that those same institutions can have a very high impact in the secular needs of the society or the general needs of the society, meaning things like serving immigrants or refugees. And so we see the largest providers indeed being supported by government, and many other programs that come through Health and Human Services are programs that are now available to the faith community as active players, as concerned citizens, as people who can be mobilized. One of the challenges, I think, in saying that is that we are very often moving on multiple levels. And if we don't stop and step back a little bit, we will allow that the immigrant wave that's coming to the United States is our third largest wave. It looks a little overwhelming. Sometimes threat looks like the agent of change. But if we see ourselves as part of faith communities where welcoming the stranger is part of our essential identity and our mission, then we become very much an active element in our society, giving a lot of people, I think, a chance to play an active role in being able to be implementers of a vision that is about an inclusive society, compassionate society, an America that's democratic not only in its politics, but in its sense of the community. We'll take a look at some of the challenges and some of the ways in which that's happened through our panel. So, rather than give you more direct content this way, let Let me introduce some wonderful people who are with us today. Matthew Sorens is with us from Wheaton, Illinois. Matthew is the field director of the Evangelical Immigration Table and training specialist in World Relief. Matthew, welcome. Nice to have you on board today. We have with us Vanessa Carter. Vanessa is with the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration at the University of Southern California. Vanessa, it's nice to see you again, having seen you in LA, and to know that you are a keen researcher on this subject, and look forward to some reports of your research work. And Patricia Moloff is with us, who is an anthropologist, sometimes lecturer at the Catholic University in DC, but also the Director of Development at Clinic. Clinic, as many of you know, is wonderful Catholic services of legal services to many people across the country. She was also the former director of the refugee programs for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Patricia, welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
And finally, Leah Bergen from my hometown of New York City, and she is with HIAS, formerly at least known to me as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. HIAS has some different programs across the United States, and we welcome Leah as one of the contributors to our work now and in the future. So let me invite all of you to jump in here and to share with us a little bit about how you see this issue. Let's start with the specificity, if we can, of one thing that excites you. I want you to tell us one thing where you see the faith community making a difference in its outreach to immigrants. You want to start in Wheaton, Matt?
Sure. Yeah, so one example that comes to my mind, actually just yesterday, I was in Iowa, visiting a little Church of the Nazarene congregation in Iowa City, which is not necessarily where people would think of as the center of immigration in the United States, but there is a growing immigrant community there. This church is a very small church, but a few years back, they hired a parish nurse, largely because they have a pretty elderly congregation. But in addition to serving the elderly, mostly white population who are part of the congregation there, they also began to serve a lot of the immigrants in their community. And from there, they started to realize a lot of the other needs in the immigrant community there in Iowa City. So they worked with us at World Relief to go through the process to become a Board of Immigration Appeals recognized legal services provider, and have 2 staff now, as well as a part-time attorney providing legal services to folks there in Iowa City. And so that's, I think, a really cool model of a way that a local church is interacting with the immigrant community, and in the process, that church is actually becoming much more diverse as well. As some of those people served by that legal services community by the parish nurse have also become part of the local church.
That's great.
That's quite a story of a congregation. Leah, you got an example like that?
I'm sorry.
Yes, actually, so HIAS, the global Jewish nonprofit that protects refugees, we helped coordinate the We Were Strangers 2 campaign, which is a Jewish campaign for immigration reform. And actually, when I was in Washington, D.C., I hosted a Seder on the second night. So it's for Passover. And I invited members of staffers from who work from Capitol Hill, and also people who work for the administration to come to a Seder. I also invited a few refugees and my family as well, so there was also Jews at the table to be able to present what a traditional Seder is like. And We Were Strangers Too creates a lot of different materials that you can use at Jewish events. So for Hanukkah, Sukkot, Passover. So we ended up using the text, and it just so happened, often in Jewish Seders, you go around the table reading different passages, and when it got to one of my friends who is a refugee, he actually had been trafficked from Somalia and ended up leaving from Egypt to come to the United States. And he ends up reading the line, once we were slaves in Egypt, and then we were set free. And it was so moving. I think it really got the staffers on Capitol Hill talking about this and touched them in such a personal way that I couldn't have done had I been in their offices on Capitol Hill.
Oh, I love stories like that. I got invited to a Freedom Passover that was built originally for a black-white experience. But what a perfect way to bring people around the table and to hear that story with new perspective, new meaning. Patricia, Vanessa, either?
Yes, I would love to share a wonderful example from our network, from the Clinic network. we have an affiliate in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's called Faith Action International House. And they have a wonderful goal called, which they say is turning strangers into neighbors. And it's a good example of where partnerships can demonstrate an impact, not only among the partners themselves, but how that can spread citywide and further. What they noticed was they were concerned about the difficulties between the immigrant community and the police agencies. So what they did was to bring both groups together, undocumented immigrants and the local police department. They sponsored monthly dialogues where the police were present, along with pastors of of the various congregations, along with the immigrants themselves. And this turned in to not only building bridges, but ultimately they were able to launch an ID program so that immigrants who were not able to access IDs through the local governmental systems were at least able to access IDs that they could be using locally. And it was a wonderful way of spreading goodwill and certainly having immigrants feel that they had a more welcoming community.
Great. Vanessa, you're jumping in?
Yeah, I'd love to. Oh, are you getting reverb?
A lot of reverb. Try it again.
All right. Is that better? Can you hear me? Can you speak up, Vanessa?
There, Vanessa?
Is this better? Can you hear me?
I can't. No, we lost you. You were better before.
Vanessa, I think if you're joining us by phone, you might as well just use the receiver.
Okay.
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Awesome.
It'd be like the CNN reporter is still using a phone from somewhere in the world.
Yeah, exactly. These are great stories. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. This kind of feels like Hollywood Squares. It's kind of fun. So one story that I'm very much inspired by is the boldness of Second Baptist Church in Los Angeles. This is a historically African-American church. One of the pulpits that Martin Luther King used to preach at when he would come to Los Angeles. And this church has changed dramatically in the past decades. Most of their congregation actually doesn't live in their neighborhood anymore, and it's 90% Latino, 45% immigrant and Latino. And this church is taking on the challenge of what it means to be a good neighbor and a good, helpful community institution in a neighborhood that has just completely changed. They asked us to work with them on a study to understand the demographics of their neighborhood, and we were able to pull in a community organization that understands that neighborhood really well, and to start building towards some new models for that church. So I'm just very impressed by their boldness.
That's great. I don't think many people think of a church doing a demographic study and how it needs to adjust to its new reality, but that's quite a story of awareness and change. All social service agencies should be so smart. That's great. One of the things we're talking about, though, is that change doesn't come easily, and there's an awful lot of resistance. And churches, by nature, and synagogues and mosques are often conservators. They are wedded to traditions that are ancient, to thousands of years of tradition. How do we teach tolerance and make them to be active elements of change? Can you see ways in which you've seen congregations motivated to become active as opposed to having one or two people stand out on this issue?
Well, I'll jump in there. I think I would say in some ways it's going back to some of those ancient things that allow us to be active on this issue. It's going, in the Christian tradition, certainly that I'm most familiar with, it's going back to our scriptures, where both in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament for Christians, and the New Testament, we've got verse after verse in the Bible that talk about loving and welcoming immigrants. And I think sometimes, I know in my Christian community, there's been blind spots there where we read those passages and somehow don't think about how those apply to the immigrants surrounding us. So sometimes it's just helping people to make those connections. One way we've done that is we put together a bookmark with the Evangelical Immigration Table that basically listed 40 Bible verses that relate in one way or another to the topic of immigration. And we've challenged people in churches around the country, would you take that bookmark? It was very intentionally not about immigration reform or about immigration policy, but a very easy, non-controversial step for a church, which all we're really saying is, would you read the Bible? And we've had a lot of churches. We've distributed about 200,000 of those bookmarks. Of course, there's a lot more people in local churches than that, so we have a lot of work to do. But we found that it really does change a lot of opinions and at least starts people to think about a topic from a perspective that they may not have considered previously.
Well, bookmarks, so that's a fun idea. Other ideas?
I'm thinking about with the evangelical immigration table and how we interviewed about 10 to 12 people who were associated with the table. And we were talking with one director of one of the organizations who was very interested in working around immigration and immigration policy, but it took actually taking some members of his board to the Arizona, California, Texas border and exposing them to what's happening actually on the border itself, that and then wrapping that with history and theology, like Matt was talking about, that made a big difference in that those members of the board of directors joining in the director's desire to get involved. So that direct experience made all the difference.
Our bishops are certainly very active in the immigration, in advocating for immigration reform and in recognition of the importance of the treatment of immigrants. And clearly through our network, although we provide legal services, technical assistance, it goes beyond that and it spreads into the parishes, into their other communities. And through the church, we have all kinds of resources available to encourage parishes to assist immigrants and to welcome them.
I would say that one of the biggest concerns in the Jewish community is losing the 20 and 30-somethings who are getting away from more organized religion. And many Jews consider being Jewish being involved in social justice issues. So actually what we found is in some young adult groups, when we've had immigration on the docket, so for example, Highest used to have a young leaders program, and it would engage 20 and 30-somethings to teach English language at a local school. That ended up getting Jews involved who actually had previously been unaffiliated with any formal Jewish institution. And so it's actually ended up bringing in different voices that had not expressed as much of an interest in the religion before, and now has started building a community for themselves in a different way.
Yes, question. By the way, behind me, my class in Immigrants and Refugees, all MSW students here at Boston College. First question.
Yeah, I have a question kind of based off what she just had said, because I come from like a non-religious background, so.
Can you hear Andrea? She's asking about folks from a non-religious background.
Right, so listening to this, it's kind of interesting. So contemporary organizations, is it more the people who are seeking out a community to carry out mission work that then find religion, or is it these religious backgrounds and people are producing people who want to carry out mission work?
Do you understand that question? Is the folks of faith community who are finding the faith community here?
Right.
Or is it people here that are helping to reach out and draw people in and give them community? But
yeah, kind of like which
chicken or egg?
Chicken or egg, yeah.
I have one sort of
Anyone?
answer to that. I don't know about that particular response, but we have been finding that in places like Utah, where it seems a little bit counterintuitive, there would be so much openness to immigrant integration work, there actually has been a lot of immigrant integration work. And what we've been testing and thinking about is that because the church there, the Mormon church there, sends out people on mission who then meet people across the world, and then when they come back to Utah, there's a new openness to immigrants. So that's been really interesting, just watching what's happening in Utah and thinking about why that is.
I love those kinds of truths. I had a member of the family who used to do these little mission trips for a small church in Alabama, and he was going to the Ukraine so often that he started adopting people that would come over as students, and suddenly the congregation had a whole group of 38 people who were Ukrainian, but it was not a church that had any reason for this to happen except one person built the human bridge. So often it's someone who cares, who makes it feel accessible. Somebody asked on the sidebar in our chat line about whether or not we are facing the fact that a lot of immigrants don't feel welcome. They don't feel there's anything there for them when they come in. They hit either the language bar or they hit a cultural bar and they just don't stay or choose to come in the first place because it feels too foreign. Have you found ways to break that down?
Well, I think that we have to keep and continue to build welcoming communities. And each community will identify ways that works best for them, given who's there and what their resources are. I know at Clinic, what we've been doing with our affiliates is to talk about integration, to introduce it systematically within our network, but then to have them share that beyond their offices with partners in their communities, so that as we look at our core standards around membership or our annual survey where we're talking about integration, we're also sharing best practices so that they can take that out and help to build welcoming spaces with other partners in their communities. And I think that, initially it is hard. Learning English is not something that one does in a matter of a month or two, and it really takes the commitment, perseverance, and a lot of positivity on the part of the receiving community to have others feel welcome.
I noticed a lot of folks in our sidebar who are with us today from across the country work for non-faith communities. So one of the things that I think we need to think about is who's invited to the table? Do we just invite the immigration lawyers and the activists, or do we invite the community to come?
Everybody can be at the table, and I think that's what's important. And when Leah mentioned this comment earlier about social justice, I do not want people to think that because this is called faith-based, they are included if they are not seeing themselves as, in quote, religious. That's not the issue. If we go back to the earlier speaker's presentation about shared values, a shared value on social justice that reaches across not only all faiths, but it's also intrinsic to people who may say they have no particular religious belief. So I think everyone can feel welcome to participate and to welcome newcomers. Everyone should be at the table, because otherwise, if you think about this whole collective impact movement that's going on now, everyone needs to be at the table and working together for it to work.
Actually, on the heels of that, HIAS has helped to coordinate the Linking Communities Project, which we deem affectionately the TLC Project. And what it's about is a group of national refugee resettlement agencies, in fact, some who are even on this call, they come together, and it's funded by the J.M. Kaplan Fund. And the purpose of it is to create a laboratory for innovative ideas in promoting refugee resettlement and integration. So one of the big things, as Patricia was saying, is to bring together actually different faiths together in the same room, and also organizations that are not faith-based. Because really, I like to say it takes an entire village to resettle a refugee. You cannot do it just an agency. It's just not possible. You need more resources than that. So one of the things that this project has done is it allows space and time for people to think about these things, when really it ends up being bottom on the priority list often as the collaboration part. And so through collaboration, we've had a lot of great projects come out of this, between teaching refugees how to advocate for themselves, to creating interfaith voice videos that can be shown in different communities and so forth. So like Patricia was saying, I really think it's important that we all come together to work together to create these welcoming communities.
And significantly, 1/3 of our network, although it has the name Catholic in it in our title, Catholic Legal Immigration, 1/3 is not Catholic within our network.
There's been some interesting findings. Oh, go ahead, Matt. I already spoke.
No, go for it.
Okay, I'll just go quickly then. There's been some interesting findings coming out of our research and thinking about bringing faith communities to the table and how to build coalitions with faith communities, and the importance of
talk to us about building coalitions. Who's in the coalition? Be specific, will you?
Sure. So I'm getting there. So I'm thinking about the difference between social justice coalitions. Those tend to be more like very local, and allied across all different issues. And immigrant integration will be one piece of it, but if it's a coalition with African Americans, then mass incarceration is a piece of it as well. So there's different types of coalitions, whereas like the Evangelical Immigration Table is a federal coalition, and they function very differently than a local coalition would. So I would urge people who are thinking about bringing the faith communities around the table to think about what kind of coalition do you want. Is it one where you ally across all issues, or is it one like the Evangelical Immigration Table where they actually have to bracket out some issues in order to stay together because it's so broad politically?
Yeah, I can jump in on that as well. Working with the Evangelical Immigration Table and the evangelical community, I certainly agree we need a very broad coalition working on making our communities more welcome. But I also think that there's value to the particularity of a particular faith tradition. If I use a very broad interfaith message with most evangelical Christians, it's not going to win them over, especially for evangelicals who tend to be more conservative. Even the language of social justice isn't always the best language to use. And I need to know who my audience is and what particular theological traditions they're coming from and how that's going to shape how they hear my message. So, for example, with the Evangelical Immigration Table, while there's a whole lot of other issues that I care about, I have to be really focused on immigration issues. If I bring in lots of other issues, inevitably it becomes divisive for a very politically diverse group of people. But there's a lot of progress we can make if we stay really focused on the particular values that unite us on the topic of immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, the evangelical church is seen in America as a conservative voice. And unfortunately, in the conversations about immigrants and immigrant welfare, have often been seen allied with political interests that have not been tremendously helpful in terms of immigration reform and other agenda. You want to talk about the immigration table and how you address this kind of I would call it a minority voice that seems very dominant in the public impression.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, as an evangelical Christian, when I started working on this in immigration work in probably 2006, I was very disturbed to find that there were so few evangelicals speaking up for immigration reform or speaking up towards more welcoming attitudes towards immigrants. And not necessarily because that's not because it's consistent with our theology, but really because we haven't paid attention to what the Bible says on this issue in too many cases. So, and if you look at the polling, there's good and bad polling. The good is a slight majority of white evangelicals and a larger majority of non-white evangelicals do support immigration reform with an earned pathway to citizenship, but we're the lowest level of support of any religious tradition. And so we've really been working to try to change that. And to do so really by looking back at how do we challenge churches to think through churches, pastors, people within local churches. How do we challenge people to look at this from a theological, biblical perspective? How do we address some of the misconceptions that are very widespread, especially among a group of people who are disproportionately likely to watch media that says some things that are not true about immigrants? And then how do we help facilitate relational bridges so that people in the immigrant evangelical community are interacting with those from the native-born evangelical community and beyond as well? But we found that, we have a lot of work to do still, but we have seen a pretty significant trend. And especially at the national level, we've had a lot of denominational leaders from very conservative denominations who, for one thing, are looking at the demographics of their churches, which are changing and becoming much more diverse, and realizing we really need to address the issue of immigration as a church and as a country.
I appreciate that you guys have been at the table. Ali Noorani, of course, is from here in Boston, and I've watched the National Immigration Forum with their Bible Badges and Business Coalition. And you guys have been very much at the table on that, and I think it's a really important part of the conversation. This is not a conversation just about what we'd call progressives or liberals. I think it's a conversation about America's future. So I'm glad for that expressed concern and leadership that you facilitate. Clinic has done some interesting things. I think of you guys as the legal beagles who are helping everybody with their forms and get through amnesty. And here I read your site, and now you're doing immigrant integration as a new initiative. Patricia, give me 2 examples. Nothing concrete. What are you doing with this initiative?
It's part of the larger package that it's not enough to just have your paperwork in order. You really we want immigrants to feel part of the communities in which they are living. So we've been taking baby steps and now have made it to where we formalized a Center for Immigrant Integration. And we are focusing initially on ESL and citizenship, of course on legal status, and then on tax assistance programs. We have we have our affiliates across the country who are helping immigrants to file their taxes. Certainly learning English and taxes are part of the larger package of showing good moral character if anyone wants to naturalize or adjust their status. And so we decided that legal status alone was not enough and we would broaden it in that way. And we've been identifying some wonderful best practices, and we'll be sharing that nationally within our network, and then outside of it with our national partners who have other affiliates as well.
That's great. And Highest has been through an interesting transition, because when I worked with you guys, I was involved with Operation Moses, and we had, 22,000 Russian Jews who came and settled in the United States, and it was really a wonderful flow of bright engineers and capable leaders, and very different from many of the other flows of migrants who come into the United States. But suddenly the government, it was actually Alan Simpson who shut that down, and we no longer had that passage open for folks who were fleeing discrimination in Russia. Highest had to go through a transformation. What have you done to be able to go beyond the Jewish community and make this work, and have the Jewish congregations, the synagogues saying, oh, sure, we want to accept folks from Karen or from some other part of Africa?
Well, there's still, just to make clear, there still is a pathway for religious minorities from the former Soviet Union and Iran. However, there's less than 200 Jewish refugees coming into the United States a year out of 70,000. So you're right, it has been a gigantic change, and we've really had to redefine our mission in a way. Well, we've always been protectors of refugees, so that's not changed. And we're actually the oldest refugee organization in the entire world of over 130 years. But we've really lost some players along the way, to be honest with you. There are some of our affiliates who are only willing to resettle or have only in the past been able to resettle Jewish refugees. And since it's really the mandate of the government, and you cannot pick and choose which refugees you take. It really, if you're going to be part of the refugee program, it has to be for everyone. So now our network has really changed a lot. We went from being the largest resettlement agency to now the smallest, of resettling approximately 4% of the refugees. I would say that we've really had to build capacity amongst our network to resettle different populations. And it has been quite a challenge to keep synagogues engaged and to keep money flowing, and to keep people engaged and advocating and volunteering to work with refugee communities. And so I would say that I think one message that's been going out is, if you're going to say never again, which is a phrase that's often used in relation to the Holocaust, then it has to be never again for everyone. And so that's a message that we keep sending out. And I think what's been happening is our affiliate network, while they used to work pretty much exclusively with synagogues, it's really expanded. So for example, in Walnut Creek, which is a suburb of San Francisco, our Jewish Family and Children's Services there has worked with a Unitarian Universalist church there. And so for example, we have a program that is geared especially to LGBT refugees. And so the Unitarians have actually partnered with us and creating these guardian groups to get, so that there will be 4 or 5 people paired up with one refugee to make sure that they have a family when they're in the United States. So I would say that we have been reaching out to Jewish synagogues, but again, we've also gone out to our neighbors and working with the broader community to also help support in the resettlement process.
That's great. You know, I love it when there's a good local story like that, because it's always in the power of the specific that we see the universal potential. I was looking at Faith Tabernacle in Utica, New York. Now, this is not exactly one of the great immigrant gateway cities, but this one congregation took in 600 Karen refugees, everything from clothing to classrooms, from furniture to friends. and they set up a series of lectures to introduce the rest of the community to this newcomer community so people learned about them. And it was really, I think, the epitome of one congregation saying, this is central to our future, our life, our ministry, and by all that they did, they've cared beautifully for not only the newcomers, but they've changed Utica in its reception and its sense of holistic welcome. Vanessa, you've looked at this as a researcher in the subject. We haven't really turned to the academic side, but you and Patricia both in university settings. Tell me, in the findings, what do you think is the primary discovery that you've made that impresses you in the way in which the faith community becomes a player in immigrant integration?
Sure. Well, we look broadly at demographic change in the U.S., our research center does, and it's just so clear that across America, we have a huge change going on demographically. And faith communities are in the midst of that. They are in the middle of immigrant integration work, whether that's African American churches in the middle of the changing neighborhoods that are now mostly Latino, mostly immigrants, whether that's the churches that Matt's working with out in Illinois or Midwest, where they're working with lower income Latinos and so many others. These are the institutions that are really doing the work to both help integrate immigrants, but also to work our nation through so much broader demographic change. The other thing I would say is how important it is, no matter what sector we're working in, to not fly in a fact-free zone. So we do research here, and facts really matter. They're not the only thing that matters, but they do matter. So there's a lot of myths about the economy. In our research, we found that immigrants really support our economy, and getting those facts right matter. And the number of children who are citizens with undocumented parents, those facts matter, and they change the conversation.
No, I would absolutely affirm that from my experience, that it is incredibly valuable that we build relationships, that we tell stories, that we ground this in particular theological traditions. But for a lot of people, the actual worries that they have about immigration are often economic or are tied to a changing cultural landscape and often based on a lot of misconceptions. So if we can help address that and you know, both through stories that rebut some of the misconceptions, but also with the hard data, I find that helps people be much more comfortable welcoming immigrants into their community.
I don't know, Pat, if you've tried this through clinic, but if there is any faith tradition doing it, since the pulpit is often the place where the signal is given to the rest of the congregation, the question is, who's affecting the clergy and how are they being encouraged? And I don't mean just the old white guys with skinny collars. I mean the larger religious profile of the country, because I find the ethnic congregations reinforce their own ethnicity beautifully and create wonderful enclaves, but they're not very integrated themselves, and they often don't participate in larger ecumenical or interfaith activities. So I'm not sure who's speaking to the clergy of the country about their power, their role, their influence. Any of you see good models?
Certainly the Bishops' Conference has been addressing this issue, not only immigration, but diversity within the church. And I think that historically you can look at different parish models, and some of the ethnic churches did actually serve to help integration for a while, and now we're looking at different models of parishes that are coming up that are integrating or including longer-term immigrants or the newcomers. Certainly, there's awareness throughout the church with our Migrant Week, with all kinds of actions on the part of the bishops and their local churches that priests are addressing this, and also parishes are doing that as well. There's a lot of work being done through the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, CARA, which is looking at multicultural churches. And I think you're probably familiar, I think you mentioned this one, the U.S. Catholic Institutions and Immigrant Integration by Don Kerwin from CMS. And historically, yeah, I have it here as well. I don't know if
Great new book.
Right, it is wonderful because it shows historically the role of the church, and also provides recommendations of where to go from here and what we can all do together.
And,
One of the things that Don did, I'll come right back to you, Leah, but one of the things that Don did in his book is he talked about the Catholic Health Network. We forget that some 60,000 health professionals are delivering incredible services in hospitals across America. And if we think about all the social institutions, and Lutherans have a gigantic social service network, most of our faith traditions do. If we think about delivery of services and just addressing how they get done, who they hire, how inclusive they are, what signals they give to the community, how they've adjusted themselves in accessibility with language and culture and hiring, it would be transformative all by itself. So we have a lot of power as leaders, employers, and as models for those who would follow behind. Leah, I cut you off.
It's okay. I was going to say also, besides educating, I guess what the equivalent would be the rabbis, I think also the leaders within congregations is so important. So, for example, I know that in Mainline Reformed Temple in Philadelphia, they just got one of the big leaders of the sisterhood organization to get engaged with organizing donations for refugees. And then it started to be throughout the entire synagogue that people would start, there would be a month where they would all, let's say, bring in toiletries. Another month would be new socks, that kind of a thing. And so once it started being that the leaders of the synagogue started getting involved, the congregation started engaging as well.
That's great. Well, we're coming to the end of our hour, and I want to give you each a chance for something you didn't get to say that you think is important, that you've been writing, thinking, saying, and that we haven't covered in this hour. So a final thought from each of you in terms of what you think is important for the rest of us to take away as we think about the faith community, its role and its work on helping with immigrant integration. Matt?
I would say the faith community has been, as you mentioned earlier, not very visible, but has been doing a tremendous amount of work for decades, as Leah mentioned, and the church as well for so many decades, all the churches. And it's expansive and it's also inclusive. And so the amount of the refugees, the immigrants are included without regard to religion or other kinds of characteristics. Everyone is a part of it. It's inclusive in the work that we do, and also as far as the staffing that we have. So there's an incredible amount of welcoming that's taking place, integrating that's taking place among the faith-based, within the faith-based community.
I would say,
Matthew?
I think kind of just following up, my last point might be on that question of how do we reach, down to the pews, if you will, or whatever the equivalent is in any particular tradition. And I'm sometimes jealous of my Catholic brothers and sisters because they've got this nice hierarchy with a bishop who can tell their priests what they're supposed to think about this. In most Protestant traditions, we don't have that. But I think we then have to be creative in looking at other ways to reach people. So we do reach out to as many local pastors as possible. We work through denominations. We also work through media. There's Christian radio stations in every community. There's television programs. There are blogs and all sorts of different options. So I would just encourage people to think through the variety of ways that we can reach people who are going to be driven to welcome immigrants, particularly because of their religious faith.
That's great. Vanessa?
Sure. In working with organizations in the Central Valley in California, a lot of them do intake in terms of DACA and possibly DAPA applications. And a lot of what they've been expressing is that, one, they need more staff and more funding to do all those applications, but then also the incredible opportunity to not just bring immigrants into our legal system, but then also in terms of having forms of documentation, but then also how to bring those folks into our civic engagement systems as well. So it's immigrant integration, not just legally and economically, but also the ways that faith-based institutions can encourage immigrants to be part of civic voice in America as well. Mm-hmm. So making that link between service provision and civic engagement.
Well
Right.
said. Service and advocacy,
Absolutely.
the voice. And Leah, last comment?
I would say that HIAS has been making a really strategic effort to try to engage the Jewish community to get involved in advocacy, volunteering, and donating. And so that seems to be the route that we're trying to get people to engage into these issues. And what I found is those personal interactions seem to speak louder, as we all know. And so just setting up scenarios where people can interact, it seems to be the most important thing in order to get communities on board.
Well, I think that's a wonderful hour well spent, and I thank you. There aren't a lot of academic papers on this. I read one by a guy named Chevy who looked at a Lutheran church in a small town in Minnesota and saw the power of one church to engage all the new Somalis who had moved there. And I think that the future depends on every one of those 1,000 little lights that we light, every little witness that we provide, every caring gesture, every initiative. And I hope that today encourages folks to think about the faith community as the primary ally, not secondary ally, in the incredible work that has to be done as we look together into the future of America, the welcome of the world to our shores, and the building of a democracy where, indeed, we are all equal. Denzel, thanks for organizing us and allowing us to participate with the Immigrant Learning Center in your fine work.
Westy and students.